Welcome to the course on how to conquer the federal government interview. In this course, we will cover how to be referred, how certs are issued, what best qualified criteria is and how it's performed, types of interview questions, how they're scored, how to answer, and sample questions with example responses. By the end of the course, you'll understand what goes on behind the scenes of the interview process and also how to best answer the types of questions that you will be asked. We'll pause for you to get ready before we dive in. Before we get started, you could help out by liking this video to help with the YouTube algorithm. Also subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you can be notified of all the new videos that are uploaded, and share with anyone that could use this information. So one question everyone has is how to get to an interview. This is the question we'll work to explain throughout the course. The very first thing is to be found qualified and referred. Being qualified just means your resume showed you meet the minimum qualifications of the job announcement that you applied to. If you need help with your resume, check out our other course on resume writing. Being referred means that you are placed on a certificate for the hiring manager to review. Under most circumstances, all qualified applicants are referred. The main exception is veterans preference. When open to the public, veterans get preference over non-veterans. This would cause someone to be eligible but not referred. After all applicants are reviewed, they are placed on lists called certificates and sent to the hiring manager for review. There are individual certs for each grade and eligibility from the announcement. The hiring manager gets to pick and choose which certs they want to use for their interviews. Once a certificate's identified, it will often go through an additional screening process to narrow down the applicant pool. This process is called best qualified criteria. We'll take a short break before explaining in detail what best qualified criteria actually means. If you need help with the entire hiring process from start to finish, check out our book, Federal Hiring Advice, Your Guide to Government Jobs, available on Amazon. The link to purchase is in the description below. Best qualified criteria is how a hiring manager reduces the number of applicants they need to interview from a specific certificate. Being referred is all about meeting the minimum qualifications, but getting to an interview is about being more than just minimally qualified. A hiring manager is looking for someone that has the experience to do the job, and the best qualified criteria is a list of additional qualifications that are used to score the applicants. Once the list is created, each applicant's resume is reviewed and scored. This process takes time and could explain some delays in interview scheduling. This is an example of a best qualified criteria list. So what you're going to have is the additional criteria and the scores. This one has education, so you get a point for an associate's, 2 for bachelor's, 3 for master's, 4 for PhD. You also have a specific program that could be something that they're looking for. This is years of experience with Microsoft Office, 1 for less than a year, 2 for 1 to 2, 3 for 2 to 4, 4 for 4 plus. And then human resources experience, just randomly for this example, in case it was an HR position, you'd have 1 for less than a year, all the same as the Microsoft Office experience. Then what you would do is score them based on the resumes provided for each applicant. So we have a 14 applicant sample with the scores tallied throughout, simulating the resume review. We're left with the totals across the bottom. And you can see the highlighted ones are the ones that are actually going to get an interview in this example. Because once everyone is scored, the hiring manager looks for the natural break and interviews everybody above that cutoff score. So in our example, 7 is the cutoff score because it's the first gap that has more than 1 point difference. So from the 9 to the 8 to the 7, that's all 1 point. But from the 7 to the 5, that's the first 2 points, so you can count that as the break. And again, in this example, because of the best qualified criteria scoring, the hiring manager now has to interview 5 less people. Now that you understand the best qualified criteria process, we'll take a break before discussing the interview questions and how they're scored. So once the best qualified criteria scoring is done, the hiring manager will start to schedule interviews. When you get a phone call to schedule your interview, you'll want to pick the first time available. The reason is that whoever interviews first is going to set the tone. Either you're going to do really well and everyone will be compared to you, or you'll do really poorly and everyone will be compared to you. Another thing is that the panel gets burned out over time. So if they are doing a number of interviews, as the interviews go on and they get to the later ones, they're not going to pay as close of attention because they've already heard a lot of the same responses over and over. They're going to be tired of typing, and it's just in your best interest to go as soon as possible. Once you get into the interview, there'll be a specific flow. Usually the panel will introduce themselves to you. They'll give you a chance to introduce yourself to the panel, and then the panel will take turns asking you questions. When you answer the question, just either close or pause and wait. After you've paused long enough, the next person will ask the question. And the panel will not stop you if you ramble, so if you continue to talk, they'll continue to let you until you essentially run out of time. Most interviews are over the phone, so leave space between when someone stops talking and when you start talking to avoid talking over them. It's really easy to think someone's done just because they have a short pause, and then you will end up talking over them and it kind of disrupts the flow of the interview. So just give a few extra seconds than you normally would before you start speaking. Then when you get to the end of the interview, they'll give you an opportunity to ask the panel any questions that you have. You'll want to avoid asking, when are you expecting to fill this position? Because the answer is always as soon as possible. As soon as they finish all interviews, they're going to tally their scores and they're going to submit a selection to Human Resources for the tentative offer to be made. Instead, what you want to do is ask questions about the job itself, about the work environment, things that you would want to know before starting on day one. The panel member is going to be made up of the hiring manager most likely, and maybe even some of the peers and coworkers that you're going to have in the new position. So if you take an interest in their workspace, it helps to create a conversation so that they can help decide whether or not you're going to be a good fit, but then you're also trying to determine whether or not they're going to be a good fit for you. Good follow-up questions at the end of the interview could be the tiebreaker between two candidates that are really close. So during a federal government interview, you could be asked a variety of questions, but the types of questions that usually catch most people off guard are called performance-based interview questions. These questions are asked as part of a story. They have multiple parts, and to get the best score, you need to answer all parts of the question. Usually the format will be problem, process, solution, outcome. So when asked questions as part of the interview, each individual question is scored. You're going to have a score between 0 and 5. 0 is going to be if you just pass, say that you don't know, you don't even attempt to answer the question. A 1 is if you just barely say anything. 2 is a little bit better but still didn't answer all parts of the question. 3 is answering all parts of the question but just barely. 4 is more information, better quality question. And 5 is what would be a perfect answer. So through the interview process, the panel members are going to take turns asking you interview questions, and each panel member will also be scoring that question. So every question is scored independently. What will happen is at the end, all the scores will be totaled to determine who is going to be selected. Generally, the highest score wins, but there are exceptions. So if the question is asked in a format of problem, process, solution, outcome, that's also how you want to answer your question. So if the question is, tell me about a time that you dealt with a difficult customer, what was the problem, what steps did you take to solve it, and what was the outcome, that is also how you're going to answer the question. So you're going to have a specific situation. Being specific is key when answering questions. and then you'll report back. You'll say, when I worked at XYZ company, I had a customer come in with a complaint. This was their complaint. I took these steps to resolve their complaint. We came to a solution. The customer came back for repeat business because they were satisfied with the outcome. Something to that effect. And this is just one example of how you would answer the question. It's not all-encompassing for every question that could be asked, but the format is the same. The key to answering the questions is to be specific. It's easy to overgeneralize when the question asks, tell me about a time that you had a difficult customer, and maybe you say, I get along with everyone, I've never had a difficult customer. That's a very low scoring question. Or if you say, yeah, I had a difficult customer this one time, I helped them and everything worked out. That is also not going to be a very good scoring question. But now that you understand what the questions may sound like, how they're going to be scored, and how to answer them, let's take a break and then come back for some example responses to some specific questions that have been asked before. Okay, so one time I had a disagreement with a coworker over how policy was interpreted. It was another supervisor, and we were having a disagreement about how to do qualifications reviews on specific types of positions and how to separate by grades and issue certificates, things like that. Part of this disagreement had to do with the policy itself as well. So when I was explaining to my peer my opinion of what I was interpreting, I provided the policy that stated in black and white what needed to be done. And then instead of having counter evidence, instead they just tried to discredit the policy itself and tried to say it was outdated, things like that. So the situation went on for about a week where we were emailing back and forth. I would provide the policy, my notes for how I interpret it. They provided their counter, and it wasn't until we got a second opinion that the coworker finally had agreed to disagree. In a sense, it was correct. The second opinion provided a higher level explanation of what the policy meant, how it's supposed to be used, which validated my opinion. So they eventually did get on board. We were able to settle the disagreement between the two of us, with a second opinion, which was just another peer. Never had to elevate to our supervisor's level. And from then on, everybody at that point was now on the same page for how to interpret the policy, how to review qualifications on these specific positions, and that everything was more consistent moving forward. So when I first started in human resources, a lot of the files were paper copy, and we had a difficult time keeping up with the files themselves. So everything that had to do with an applicant's position that they're applying to, their selection documents, their pre-employment documents, the job announcement, everything like that was kept in a folder. It's called merit promotion folder. And what would happen is every specialist in the office would keep this hard copy folder on their desk in a rack, and if somebody needed it, they had to physically go to the office, take the folder, and carry it to their office, and then hope that it got brought back when they were done with it. And this often led to documents going missing. They were all the originals. Very rarely were they ever scanned in right away. They were waited to be scanned at the very end, and which led to another problem, is that a lot of the documents from these files needed to be uploaded to each candidate's electronic personnel folder once they started. So part of this project, where it was my idea to start to move towards digital, worked with my supervisor to get a small team together, and I was in charge of the team because it was the suggestion that I had made. So the outline of the project was to create electronic folders that were shared with everyone, and that as documents came in, the files were scanned in right away to those electronic folders, and we no longer had paper folders. So this accomplished two different goals. One, no more paper files getting lost, but two, it also, you scan the documents in as they were received, so that everyone could have access to them, and so that it was easier to upload them to the electronic personnel folders instead of just having to scan several documents all at once and upload them. They were already scanned in, so half the process was complete. So my role was to create the outline, working with a team on how we would make this work, and other members of the team would then we would just test. So we would scan in documents, we would get feedback from office mates, and then once we were able to kind of show that this was a much better process, we were able to get the supervisor buy-in in order to make it mandatory for everyone to function this way. And so that was the end result, was that at the end of this project, we now scanned everything in as it was received. It was in a central location for everyone to have access, and it allowed for files to be found more quickly. You could find them even if the person was on leave. You could get them uploaded to EOPF a lot quicker, and overall was just a much better process. And then the process stayed in place and was actually continually improved upon as systems changed, so that it remained to be a paperless office. And that in turn led to some other big wins, such as telework and remote work, so that being remote, being virtual, you rely on digital, and you don't have access to printers and scanners to be able to handle hard copy documents. Working in human resources, I often have competing priorities. The main things that we will juggle are coding of personnel actions, also, posting job announcements, reviewing applicants, consulting with services, and generally answering questions through instant message, email, phone, all day long. Now, there are some timelines that have to be met, the main one being the coding of personnel actions. That takes priority over any other action because it impacts someone's pay. So either it's a brand new employee that has their accession that needs to be coded so that they can even receive their first paycheck, or it's pay impacting actions, general adjustments, step increases, or promotions that need to be coded so that they can go into effect. And you have a certain window that you can code in, so that's where coding becomes priority when everything else is being worked. So when I approach these things, coding is number one priority. Then what I would do is post a job announcement if there was one needing to be posted, because that announcement is going to have an open period that gives me some breathing room to take care of some other tasks, like reviewing applicants on another announcement I might have open, or answering some of these other questions. So 15 business days is usually the standard open period for an announcement, and that's why I would generally post an announcement second to coding personnel actions. And then while that announcement's open, I'll work on reviewing applicants or answering questions or working on other projects. And then once that announcement closes, then I'll be in the same cycle as everything else with reviewing those applicants, issuing those certs. Here are a few things that we learned. We learned that referred means sent to the hiring manager on a certificate. Certificate is just a list of applicants for the hiring manager to review. Certificates are reduced using the best qualified criteria to limit the number of applicants needing to be interviewed. The hiring manager schedules their own interviews once best qualified criteria is done. When called to schedule an interview, you want to pick the first time that's available. When interviewing, you want to give extra space when responding if the interview is over the phone to avoid from talking over a panel member. The questions that will be the most difficult to answer are the performance-based interview questions, and they're scored from 0 to 5. When answering, you want to be specific and answer all parts of the question, and be sure to ask good questions at the end of the interview. Thank you for watching the video. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer. If you need to work one-on-one, you can visit the website at www.federalhiringadvice.com and we can schedule a time to meet.